Hi girls, greetings of the day. Today we're going to have a look at Samuel Ajayi Crowther's a letter when he wrote from during his capture into slavery and how he was rescued. So here it's titled The Narrative of Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Now Samuel Ajayi Crowther was born in the Igbo section of Yoruba, and you know that he had undergone a great traumatic experience of being stolen, or rather kidnapped, from his own hometown or home village and traded to different sets of people. Now, before we plunge into this essay, let's just understand how things went about during that time. By 1807, Britain had outlawed outlawed the Atlantic slave trade. So that means to say they never encouraged it, they almost stopped it. But then the Spaniards, people of Spain and the Portuguese, were still involved in it. So what happened here? In Nigeria, a particular group of people called the Fulani traders, they normally kidnapped these Muslim Fulani traders. They normally kidnapped these children, not just the children, the elders also. I shouldn't be using the word kidnap. Rather, they displaced them. They captured them and sold them as slaves to the Spaniards and the Portuguese. Now, this whole narrative is about how Samuel Ajayi Crowther, at the age of 12, was displaced from his hometown, taken away by slaves, by different owners, and how he was rescued by the Britishers. So this is the whole thing about this story, this narrative. And you have here, before you get to know about what exactly is there in the narrative, let's have a look at the writer's family members. The father's name is Ayemi, Ayemi, and the mother is Mother Afala. Later on, she was christened or baptized, rather, she embraced Christianity, and she was christened Hannah, Hannah, Hannah. Okay, so with this bare introduction, I thought I will get into the narrative of Ajayi Crowther. Now and then I might shift my gaze from this laptop to the monitor wherein I have my text. So it might look odd, but then I think it's manageable, girls. So here you see Ajayi Crowther was ordained as the first African bishop of the Anglican Church. Okay, like soon after he was rescued by the Britishers, after a long struggle, soon after he was rescued, he talks about how he embraced Christianity, and thereafter he rose up to become the first African bishop of the Anglican Church. So as I told you, when he was 12 years old, he was captured, and he was captured along with his mother, his sister, his toddler brother, and also his cousins. And you will get a very graphic narrative of a picture of how they were abducted. Okay, so along with the other villagers, he was captured. He was captured by the Muslim Fulani slave raiders. Okay, in the year 1821, and he was sold to Portuguese slave traders. Now, here is this narrative is a kind of a letter written to Reverend Williams Jowett who was the then secretary of the Church Missionary Society. Now, please remember this society, girls. This Church Missionary Society is a society that you will come across quite often in future also. So here is a very captivating narrative of how Crowther was captured into slavery and rescued. So here is a letter. Now please, we know the format of a letter, and so as it says here is he had written it in Fowey Bay on February 22nd in the year 1837, and Fowey Bay is a free town in Sierra Leone. Okay, so he begins this way: Reverend and dear sir, and so on. So he's saying the first thing that he needs. So after all the trauma that he has experienced, it's wonderful to note that he begins it with a positive note, saying, I have the happiness to, though I was captured into slavery, I had the happiness, or I had the privilege of getting to know the gospel, and that's one thing that I really appreciate about this slavery. So he's saying, in the year, that is to say 1821, when he was in his native country, when, look at this word, he's saying, when I was enjoying the comforts of father and mother. So girls, I think you need to really appreciate the presence of your father, your mother, your brothers and sister, and the life that you lead along with them. Do not take it for granted. Okay, so he says it's a comfort. I would use the word, it's a luxury. Okay, so he says, I was enjoying the comforts of my father and mother, and I was also enjoying experiencing the love of my brothers and sister. So he's saying that is the day when the unhappy thing happened. But then he's saying, okay, though it is unhappy, I call it the blessed day also, which I shall never forget in my life. Why does he call it a blessed day? Yes, he calls it a blessed day because he embraced Christianity. He got to know about Jesus Christ, and he feels he's been redeemed. Okay, so he's saying, I call it an unhappy day. Why does he say so? All of a sudden, the whole family was dislocated in their father's absence. They were taken away from the father's house. They were separated from their relations. Okay, they were into slavery, and so as I told you, I just wanted to highlight the thing of happiness. He says, I call it a blessed one because that's the day God had marked it to be a day when I was taken away from the land of heathenism. What is heathenism? Paganism, non-Christianity. Okay, so he describes his own native land as land of heathenism, superstition and vices. Okay, vice opposite of virtues. And so from there he was taken to a place where gospel, the good news of God, was preached. So that is why he feels so happy about it. Now he goes on to describe, he's saying, for some years there was a war going on in his own country called Oyo. EYO. So he says that, and that's when during the wartime there was lots of, naturally there were lots of bloodshed and devastation. Men, women, children, everybody was caught, and they were taken as captives. They were taken as captives by their enemies. Okay. Now this war was principally carried on by Oyo Mohammedans, the Muslims, okay, Oyo Mohammedans. And as I told you earlier, so the country was bound to the Faulas or the Fulbe, and these people, they always captured these native Oyo people, and they traded them with the Spaniards and the Portuguese people. So he's saying they started selling them as captives, these captives or the captors, to the Spaniards and the Portuguese who were on the coast. So the Oyo is not on the coastal side, nor is there any water body. Why do I stress this? I'll let you know a little later. Okay, so one particular morning in the town Oshugu, or also gun. That's how he says. When we were all, he's saying it was a very normal day. We were all preparing breakfast, and we had no apprehension of what was about to happen. We never visualized something untoward will happen. But at a particular time, at 9 o'clock, what happened? Enemies had approached, and he also describes to us very vividly about how the town was fortified. Okay, he says the town was fortified with a wooden fence, and this wooden fence was a long stretch that extended to about 4 miles in circumference. Okay, and this particular wooden fence, within this fence there was almost 12,000, there were almost 12,000 inhabitants, and of these 12,000 inhabitants there were strong 3,000 strong men who could fight against people, and these inhabitants were duly prepared also. There were 6 gates, and many men, robust and strong men, they would stand at different places and they would defend their town or city or whatever you call it. But then it was a great pain to people. You know why? Because they had been struggling to defend their own town from the raiders. Raider, struggling to defend their town from their enemies or the raiders, and it was almost resistance for 3 to 4 hours, he says. Still, the mission was a failure. They couldn't guard the people from the attacks of the enemies. What happened was there was sorrowful scenes that followed it. Some of the women, they started fleeing away from their places. They started running away from the enemies who were chasing them. So when they were running away, certain women used to be carrying 3 or 4 or 6 children even, all clinging here and there, clinging to their arms, clinging onto their shoulders. I'm getting goosebumps, girls. Clinging onto their shoulders sometimes, and along with that they had to have baggages also, which they carried on their heads. They ran as fast as they could, and when they were running, they could not see, because their vision is sometimes hidden, probably because they were carrying too much of luggage, because of the fear, and they just had to run. That was their ultimate motive. So when they were running, prickly shrubs were there, so it pricked them. Sometimes it tore their clothes and all that, and they were at one point of time, see, out of planning, they took some baggage with them, but at one point of time when they could not run fast from their enemies, what did they do? They threw away all their baggages and they started running, because they wanted to pay attention only to their children and care for them. So now when they were doing that, some of them couldn't move further. So now, how did these captors capture these people? That's very, I don't know, it's too inhumane and it's too painful to think of it and imagine of it, even after centuries now. What did they do? They had rope on which they had tied up a noose, noose, okay? They tied up a noose and they threw it, and when they flung the rope, it would go and catch on to their neck. They would tighten the noose, okay, as you would hang yourself. They would tighten the noose, and after that they would drag them up. Now when they were dragging, what would happen? A mother would be having 6 children. So the mother would be dragging with the child that she could hold, would be dragged with the child that she was holding on to. And what about the other children? So the mother and 1 or 2 children would be with somebody, and the other children would be somebody. So this was the time when the family was totally divided. They were divided among 2 or 3 or 4 enemies sometimes, and with that it ends. They will, even if they wanted to, only if God wanted to, they could meet again. Otherwise they were never able to meet again also. Now here he goes on to again describe, see, look, even after becoming an Anglican bishop, he is very humble enough to say, your humble servant was caught with his mother and 2 sisters. And of the 2 sisters, one was an infant, almost 10 months old, just 10 months old. And he had a cousin also. So when they were trying to escape, he says, the only thing that he remembers to have held with him is, he was a boy, just of 12 years old. But the only thing that he held him with him was bow and 5 arrows in the quiver. Quiver is the container in which you have the arrows. But then he says, as he ran fast, he doesn't remember where he lost them, but he lost them. And then he's saying, when I recollect about my father, I feel that I never got to see him thereafter. And then when because he was the one who came back from the fences, wooden fences that they were guarding, and he gave them a signal asking the family to run away. So he's saying after that he has never seen his father, and he's saying he never got to see him afterwards. And see, whenever so he's saying unhappy and comfortless father. Okay, thereafter he gets to know that the father was killed in another ambush or another battle. Now he starts to describe his conquerors. He says his conquerors were Oyo Mahmudans. Please learn the spelling, girls. O-Y-O Mohammedans, Mahmudans, Mahomendans. Okay, so these people, they led them through the town, and when they were going along, they saw that there was a man struggling for life and death. Now, what do we normally do when we see somebody struggling for life and death? We pause, we help them out, but such thing couldn't happen. So he's saying that's the time when the Fowlers or the Full Bay, they saw to it that the family was separated, and for the first time they got separated from their cousin. And he now and then when he gets separated from his family members, he uses this word, I must take thy leave, my fellow captive cousin, he says. And then what happens? Once they capture all these people, they set the town on fire. So everything was burning, the houses, and there's a description, you can go through that, girls. I have highlighted it in blue, so when you read your text, you can go through that. So the whole town was set ablaze, and it was under flame. And then as they were passing by, he remembers that they were passing by his grandfather's house. That's now already desolate. There's nobody there. There's no life there. It's full of misery. Okay, so now he's saying the whole town was at the mercy of the flames. And then he bids farewell, like his cousin, he bids farewell to the place of his birth, his playground, the playground of my childhood, it says. And he's saying, when I was a child, I used to be thinking, this is the place that I would be buried when I'm old and dead. Okay, but then he never gets to return to his place. Then he says, now they move on from Oshogan to another town called Ajayi or Ajayi. Okay, that was 20 miles away from town. Do you think they were taken by a bus or a car? No, they had to walk all the way. So when they were walking, they see their grandmother at a distance, and the grandmother was also managing to carry 3 or 4 cousins with her. And she was missed through the crowd. Nobody could see her, but still there were other captors also. This is her grandmother's, mother's, children and cousins, and almost everybody was led as captives. Oh, sorrowful prospect, he says. And then he's saying, suddenly he remembers about the old people. He's saying old women were normally to be pitied. You know why? One thing is their age. They couldn't walk faster, and when they had to save their children or their dependents. So when they tried their best to do that, the captors wouldn't allow that to happen. So they always would threaten them, saying, if you don't walk fast, we're going to kill you. So that's one thing. Now he says, oh, beautiful sight. And he's saying, whose heart won't bleed if you watch that. Then he's saying, so from morning till evening they keep walking, and nowhere or throughout he has never told us about anything about the food or the water. Then he says, by the evening they came to a spring of water, and they started drinking the water, and he says served as for breakfast. So probably that was what was served as breakfast for them. And then he's saying, yeah, we got to have a little parched corn also, a little dried up meat. Probably that was something that was in store for the victors, maybe looking at the children starving a bit, because if they starve and die, it's not going to be of any use to them. So they were given something to eat. Now when they were marching through Ajayi, they passed through several towns and villages, and all these towns and villages were pitiably reduced to ashes. Now, it's not just evening, it's almost midnight. So, even through the night, they had to walk. And so, they had been walking a mile from the wall of Ajayi. And again, as he already told us, there was an old woman who was about 60, and she was threatened. That's to say, if she doesn't walk fast. Imagine, no? All through the day, they've been walking. It's their age factor also, but still, they are threatened heartlessly. So, now he says, next morning, the cards that, so they still have the cards, they are just they're used kind of as if they are reins, okay, so they were just led along with the cards, and they were taken by their necks. So they were, he's saying, for the first time the next morning the cards were removed from their necks, and they were taken to the chief of their captors. And he's saying there are many chiefs and like trophies placed at the feet of a chief, meaning to say that they have brought their loots, okay, so they place it. And at that time what happens, there is a separation. And so his sister, there were two sisters I told you, and his cousin, he got separated already. So his sister and his mother, and that's to say they were for one chief, and his mother and the infant topped the victors, so they were on the top list sort of. Now there were loud cries, sobs, because this is the moment when the families are separated, so the children don't want to leave their parents, the mother or whomever elder they think is their family member or their relative. So you hear cries and all that. And now the mothers were, his mother was with the infant, and they were always led away, giving promises that they would see them again. So they had to leave Ajayi for another place called Dada, okay, and that was the town of the chief to whom they was handed over. Now in a few hours what happens, he was there. Now they started bartering him for a horse. I suppose you know what bartering is. You give one for something else and get it done. So he was bartered for a horse in Ajayi, and that's, he says, is the first time that he got separated from his mother and sister for the first time in their life. So in the 24 hours, he was deprived of all liberty and all comforts, and he says in that 24 hours he became the property of three different persons, girls, three different persons. And so in 24 hours, if that could happen, imagine what could have happened in the space of 2 months. So when the chief was leaving the town of Ajayi, there was this horse, and then so instead of the horse, he was the chief bought the horse and he sold this boy to or gave away this boy. But later on there was somebody who took him to Dada, and there he had the happiness to meet his mother and sister. So he was again with joy. Then he's saying when he met his mother for the first time, there were tears of joy and affection, and the little infant also reacted because she recognized the brother and she started leaping out of joy, he says. And he's saying there he lived for another 3 months, and every day he had to go collect some grass for with his fellow captives for the horses. And then he visited his mother and sister in the captor's house. Then the mother quietly told that she has never got to hear about his sister. Probably they did something to the sister. They have taken away because she's young. They must have sold her off. We do not know what happened, or even killed her. No idea of what has happened. Then he says, at last an unhappy evening arrived. What happened? He was sent with a man to get some money from a neighboring house. So when he went, it said by now with his experiences of being a slave, a captor, he understood. So he had a kind of an intuition. There were some fears. So when he went there, he was added on to the number of captives who were there. So he left for the market town early the next morning, and so he was unfettered. Like there were other captives, but he was not chained. The next day, he's not with his mother now. He came to a place to give some money, and there he was captured. So the next morning they take him. Throughout the night he had not been sleeping. He lost all his sleep because that's the first time that he was in the same town but haven't got to meet his mother at all. He's saying, I have not met my mother for the past day or two. Then this was the same condition for another boy. His mother, at least his mother was in Iceland, but this fellow's mother, his companion's mother was in the other. And he's saying, because I was not asleep, because I couldn't sleep due to fear, I heard the first cock crowing. And thereafter what happened, the traders got up, they loaded the men and the slaves with baggage, and this little fellow who was there captured along with him, he started crying a lot, and he begged that he should be allowed to see his mother, but the captors did not allow him, and they punished him a lot. And therefore the narrator was cautioned, and he didn't ask anything about it at all. And he says that is how he was separated from his mother and sister. Then after a few days of travel, he says they came to the market town of Ajayi, and he's saying there there were some relations who were free, so they started looking for their own people, and many people were looking for their own relations. But then soon some of them have also escaped from their captors. So but then in a few days he was sold to a Mohammedan woman, and this woman, she traveled to many towns. When they were on their way to Popo country. From there, on their way, she traveled to many towns, and particularly Popo country is a town or a place where you have coast, and many Portuguese people lived there, and they came there only to buy slaves. So when they left Ajayi, after many halts, they came to a town called Toko. Girls, I think you should learn all these names fastly and thoroughly. So from Ajayi to Toko, they all spoke a dialect called Egba. But his mistress, she spoke Oyo, his own dialect. So now he's saying, I have become a perfect stranger in my own. So he has left his own Oyo country far behind, and he's become a stranger in a new land, in an alien land. So he lived in Itako, and for 3 months, and with his owner's son, he used to be roaming about in the place. But then he couldn't think of going a mile far away from the town at all. And then he's saying on the highway, then now and then they would kind of create a fear in these people. How would they do it? They would punish people, they would hang them up in the marketplaces for them to see, and that will be a kind of a fear. And such fears were kindled. And you find, he says, 5 or 6 heads of such people were nailed on the large trees in the marketplaces. That's barbarous, okay? That's cruelty at its peak, I would say. Then he's saying, now and then his mistress would speak with him and his son, and they would say bye-bye, and then she would ask them to go buy tobacco. So the woman was also indulging in a kind of an illegal trade. She would ask them to sell and return. But by now he guessed that that he wouldn't stay in the same place for a longer time, and that he would be sold to the Portuguese. And pretty much similar to that, he was sold to the Portuguese also. And then when the very thought of being taken away by the Portuguese to a different land made him very sick, and he says he got his stomach upset and all that. But still, he was determined that he will not go to the Popo country, that's to say the Portuguese probably Portugal. Okay, so for the first time in life, he decides to do something. He says he tried to strangle himself with his own band, but then he did not have the courage to tighten the noose. Then he say, now that he's a Christian, he realizes the importance of the life given to him by God. Yes, girls, the life that we have is God's gift to us, and we have no right to take it away. Okay? This is a message to you all. And so he says, may the Lord forgive me. Then he says, time and again he would try to slip out from the canoe into the river and all that. But then he was sold to some persons. Then he's saying, the Lord, he led me into temptation and delivered me from evil. That is to say, he didn't commit suicide. Then he says, so when they sold him to the Portuguese people, imagine, girls, where he's being sold, and the money that they receive, they counted in front of his eyes, and he says, I am with my new owners. And the first cock crowing, because he's again sleepless, he gets to see. Then he says they set out for another new place called Jabo or Ijabo, and here he comes across the third dialect for men, my third dialect. So please understand, girls, it's not just being dislocated from the family, it's not from the town, it's not just being separated from the family, it's not just being punished physically, so physical abuses, and then he has to undergo a lot of psychological and emotional turmoil and conflicts also. Besides all these things, the language that he speaks is not the language that the people of his country, the people of the alien land speak to. So by now he has come to a place where they speak the third dialect. So he says he arrived at Aikeko Ere. Please learn the spelling, girls, it's your headache. I know for sure. And then he's saying he's tried to strangle again, but then he's saying, yeah, I tried strangling, but why didn't it strike me that I could kill myself with a knife also? But he says I never struck him. Like earlier when he was bartered for a horse, he says now he's bartered for a tobacco and rum and other articles. And there, so rum vangi, tobacco vangi, ipa ivara kudutachi. So there he was without any chains, fetters means chains, but still he was like a slave before they could really identify which owner he has to go. And now the chiefs, the local chiefs, no, they were very particular. They knew that it was white man's liquor, and they wanted to show off that they were very friendly with the slaves or the captors. So they gave them to this liquor a bit, a sip to taste. Okay, so then he's saying he had to remain alone in Jabo, another town, and after a few days walk, they walked to a slave market called Ikosi. So the name of the slave market is Ikosi. Now this slave market, so I told you earlier on, he has not seen a large water body. Now for the first time he comes to the coast of the bank of a large river, after which he was captured. Large river, and that river probably was the lagoon on which we afterwards captured. So he's saying now this thing, now for the first time there is another phobia that he experiences, the sight of the river, and he's saying it was too much. Now he understood that they are going to take him to the opposite bank called Echo, and so before sunset he was again, so ஒருத்தர்கிட்ட இருந்து கைமாறி டொபாக்கோக்கும் ரம்முக்கும் கைமாறி வந்த பிறகு now they are taking him again to be bartered for tobacco. So now he is under the custody of another owner. Now they were asked to enter the river. He was so scared of the river, so as he was entering he was very cautious to walk along the river. But then as he was he was quite delaying and all that, and looking at the time, some people carried them and they put him into the canoe, and when they placed him in the canoe, they placed him along the corn bags, so didn't have a proper seat to sit also. And when after placing him, little boy, no, so they placed him on the atop a corn bag. So after placing him on the corn bag, they supplied him with a dish called abala for his dinner. So he says he was seated on the corn bag in the same position with his abala in his hand, and he was quite confused, he says. But he was there till 4 o'clock in the morning, and then he says so long he has seen only the third dialect, but now he's all together getting to hear another new language. And he's saying there is a very faint shadow of my own. I left my home, my family, my own identity, my own language, my own food and everything. Then he's saying, okay, all these days I've been thinking of killing myself, committing suicide by strangling. And he said, I didn't ever think of killing myself with a knife. But then he's saying not a single thought came to my mind about leaping into the river, because all through he was so scared of the river, and that was the greatest phobia in his life. So now they entered the other side or the other bank of the river. It was Echo Lagos. Okay, in this place he got to meet two of his nephews, but they were belonging to different masters, and this town was particularly occupied by the Portuguese and the Spaniards, and they had come to buy their slaves there. Then he's saying, though I was in Lagos for more than 3 months, he's saying he never got to see any white man there, but they were all, though they keep saying about the Spaniards and the Portuguese, he never got to see the white men there. And he's saying we all took a walk, and we were in the company of about 6 of us. They were allowed to just roam about in the walking along, and he's saying that we were all there. And you know what happened? They came to the street of the house, and he, like, gradually he was made as a slave, the 8th member of the Portuguese. But then they were not in fetters, they were allowed to roam about freely. Why? Because the river divided them, and they knew for sure that these fellows won't cross the river, risk their lives to go be there. Now we always say that there are war veterans, okay, but he's saying maybe I can use this term veteran to call myself a veteran of slavery. Then he's saying whatever came my life, I took it very patiently. And then for the first time, in the earlier paragraph, we say he became the 8th to be added to the pack of slaves sold. Okay, so he says for the first time he felt the touch of a white man. So shocking. Why? To check if it was fine, if he was healthy enough to be bought, if he was worthy enough to be invested upon. So the white man examined him, and then men and boys, all of them were chained together. And he describes the chain also. It was a chain of about 6 fathoms in length, and he's saying there were iron fetters on the neck of every individual, but then at the end there were padlocks also. Unimaginable, girls. And then he's saying the situation, the boys suffered the most, because when the men were pulled, the boys were the little ones, and they had to just move around, swoosh, they would have to go. And then he's saying it was hurting a lot. There were lots of bruises, and especially during the time of sleep it hurt a lot. And he's saying whenever they pulled them to make them come closer, it hurt them, it suffocated, it bruised them to death. And I don't want to linger on it too much, girls, it's so very depressing. Then he's saying very often, whenever during nights, what would happen, 2 or 3 elders would fight among themselves. So when they quarreled or fought among themselves, the whole drove of the slaves would be punished, and that was too much. And with this iron fetters around them, they had to go together to toilet, they had to go together to have a bath, and so on. If this was the condition of the male members and the boys, worse and unimaginable is the condition of the female one. Okay, females, they were really tortured a lot. So here he underwent such tortures for almost 4 months, and by this time the English people who were along the coast, they had a sniff of it, and so that was another matter of sorrow. See, they get used to, these slaves, by the time they get used to something, by the time they get accustomed to something, by the time they get acquainted with something, they have to face another new master or new situation. Therefore it becomes a subject of sorrow to him, and he's saying that was a subject of sorrow to him. He had a fear again whether there would be a kind of a war among the Portuguese and the Spaniards and the English who were against the Atlantic slave trade. And so he was wondering, and therefore their embarkation, that is to say leaving from there, was delayed a bit. But then, however, Joseph Bartholomew, he's saying when the whites came along with them, there was this person called Joseph Bartholomew, who was his brother in the service of the church missionary society. So after week's delay, they embarked at night in canoe from Lagos to the beach. Okay, the crew, how many people were there, was busy embarking, and 187 of them were there, and they hardly had any time for supper or breakfast. But anyway, they had to endure everything, the whole lot of seasickness and all that. So the Portuguese were trying to see to it that they guard these slaves from the side of the English, from the side of the Englishmen who are trying to attack them, who are trying to free them. But somehow, he says, by the very same evening, like God sent, two English men of war, they came, okay, and now he says we were in the hands of new conquerors. He's saying he was so scared of them. You know why? Because they had long swords with them. So these two very large men of war and other people, they were there, and the men of war, he says, His Majesty's ships Myrmidon. So that's the name of the ship that came there. Captain J.H. Leake and Iphigenia, Captain Sir Robert Menz, they captured them on the 7th of April 1822 on the river Lagos. Okay, then he's saying what happened to their owner. The owner was now bound with the sailors. So reversal of order. Okay, and except the cook was caught and he was made to prepare breakfast for all. So he was preparing breakfast, but the owner was bound, and he's saying the hunger, they were so hungry that probably made him a little bold, and is saying so they had a kind of a liberty to move around in the vessel. So as they were given liberty and as they were allowed to move around, he says he started nurturing good opinion about his conquerors, and he says the 187 of them were divided into different were taken away by the Englishmen in different vessels means must be a kind of a ship or any other kind that could sail through. Okay, so now the new fear, they had a new fear. Girls, if you were asked to write on the fears that Ajayi Crowther underwent or experienced, you should be able to. So he's saying what was the fear? The fear of what misery would come to them. Okay, so now being in one ship, being transported in one ship, they all felt like they belonged to one great family. So now 6 of them were together, and along with them was one brother, Joseph Bartholomew, and he was very close together, probably, yeah, and they were all carried away at the same time, and they went by the ship Myrmidon, and so he's saying he was not sure of who had transshipped before him and all that. But when they tried to excuse me, when they tried to explore the ship that they were being transshipped, he noticed for the first time hogs, pigs, hanging, and the skin not black, the skin of the hogs were not black, but it was white, so something that was different, and he noticed a culture change there. Please read those 4 lines for yourself, girls. You will see that at home they used to roast the leg of the hogs, to see to it, to ensure that the hairs were burnt and that they were not, but they had a different pattern. So read it for yourself. Then he's saying by now they became too familiar with these people, and they were at home with these men of war. Now they were only 6 in number, and so they were selected by the sailors for their boys. So soon they were given clothes, and now you see the Portuguese owner and his son were bound. Okay, they were bound in fetters. Now this fellow Ajayi Crowther for the first time had mustered all courage, and he had the boldness to go and strike him on the head. Were thinking that he will not have to meet him again. Okay, so now his vessel was towed along the man of war, but after a few weeks, what happened? Everything was destroyed at sea by captors being found unseen. See, they had different kinds of ships by the Portuguese, by the people. So the Englishmen who just rescued them, they saw to it that the ships that were not worthy of sailing, or that were not seaworthy, were destroyed, he's saying. Then he's saying so the ship had one part, and one part of it was the slaves, and so he's saying another because they found that one brig or kind of a ship or kind of a vessel, it was sinking. So almost many of the slaves and the sailors lost their lives. So idu kuda nadanduchi on the way. So they had to experience the rough and tempestuous sea voyage also. So many of them died, except 5 of them who later on joined. We found the boat after 4 or 5 days. Those 4 or 5, they had saved themselves. Probably life-saving boat they must have used it. And when they met them after 4 or 5 days, they were almost in the form of skeletons. Why? Because they never had food and all. So totally, how many people were lost? 102 of our number. So girls, it's just an ordinary number. All human beings, they were lost. Okay, then how long did they have to sail? 2 months. And so when they reached the coast, they reached Sierra Leone on the month of in the month of June, on 17th of June in 1822. And the same day they were sent to Bathurst. Earlier it was Leopold, and this place was under the care of Mr. Thomas Davy. And he's saying here for the first time he had the pleasure of meeting his own country people, and there they assured them that they would experience liberty and freedom. Okay, now again he has another fear. What is that? That he would be sent to Freetown. They have to go to Freetown and testify again in the court against the Portuguese owner. But then they were not really happy, because they didn't know what turn the situations might take. So but as time was passing by, and many of them were not willing to give their consent to go and testify against the Portuguese owner, somehow it got overlooked. And then from then onwards, what happens? He was under the care of the Church Missionary Society. And in 6 months after his arrival in Sierra Leone, he says he was able to read the New Testament, and that's what brought in a lot of change in him. And he could read that, and he says he experienced some kind of a freedom, and he was made a monitor also because he was good at it. And when he did something good, he was rewarded also. Earlier on, they were always punished, but for the first time he talks about reward, and he's saying because he was good at reading and interpreting the Bible and transmitting the same to his fellow people, he was rewarded with 7 pence halfpenny per month. Okay, then he's saying the Lord touched him and he opened his heart, and he wanted to obtain pardon through Jesus Christ. So he was baptized. So he became a Christian on the 11th of December 1825 by Reverend J. Rabin. Then he's saying so he had the short privilege of visiting your happy and favored land in the year 1826. Thereafter, he became a teacher to his own fellow beings, and he's saying probably that's what God wanted me to do it. And one after the other, there was a hike in his career, an improvement in his career. And he's saying, I had the wished for instruction in the tuition of Reverend C.L.F. Hansel, who landed in Sierra Leone in 1827. Then he's saying, thereafter he became a qualified person to help in the service of the Church Missionary Society. So probably he was ordained a priest also, and he engaged himself in the service of Christ, and that was perfect freedom, he calls it. Okay, then he's saying, I think I should acquaint you to the kindness of Providence, God and heaven. And the day, so he comes back to where he began. He's saying, the day of my captivity was to me a blessed day. Why? Because he got to know about Jesus Christ, and he was redeemed, he says. And consider in this respect, but then it was unhappy also. Again, he stresses and reinstates that it was unhappy because he was deprived of his father, mother, sister, and other relations. Okay. I could not as it find a dozen Osogan people among the inhabitants of, but still he underlines the fact that there were not many Osogan people in Sierra Leone. Then he's saying he got married to a Christian woman, when on 21st September 1829, and earlier she was captured by His Majesty's ship band Captain Charles Phillips on the 31st October 1822, but thereafter she was rescued. So she was rescued by by Captain Charles Phillips, and he says since their marriage, the Lord had blessed them with a son and two daughters, that's three children, and that the time may come when the heathen shall be fully given to Christ for his inheritance. So now that he has tasted God, now that he has experienced God's love, and he feels that the love that God bestows upon us is so tasty, he desires that others should also taste it. So according to the biblical verse, taste and see that the Lord is good. He wants the other heathen and non-Christians also to taste and see that other non-Christians in the different parts of the earth may become God's child. And that's what is his earnest prayer, he says, and he signs off saying, your humble, thankful and obedient servant, Samuel Crowther. It was a very painful experience, but still I think we need to know about it so that we understand the significance of people, human beings, the significance of love in our lives, the significance of family in our lives. Let's respect, revere and honor all that, and live our present in a very grateful and a loving manner. Okay, girls, so thank you. Hope it's clear to you all.